All right, if everyone can start taking their seats, we're going to get started. My name is Naomi Inglar. I'm the Communications Coordinator for the Tulane Prevention Research Center and the Tulane Center of Excellence in Maternal and Child Health, both of which are here at the School of Public Health and Tropical Medicine. I'm here today to kick off the Fall 2017 Health, Racism, and Communication Seminar Series hosted by our two centers, as well as hosted by 4 amazing student groups who are our co-sponsors, and I'm going to list them all. We have the Tulane Society for Young Black Public Health Professionals, the Tulane Society for Sexuality, Health, and Gender, and Salud for Latin American Communities, as well as the Tulane School of Public Health and Tropical Medicine Student Government Association. So we definitely want to thank those student groups for participating and partnering with us on these series. They've evolved over time. They started off as communication skill-based seminars talking about how to write a letter to the editor, how to write a policy brief, and we started to hear from students and people attending that they wanted to talk about tougher issues and how do we communicate these issues through our work as public health professionals as well as community organizers. And so I'm very excited today. Diamond from the Tulane Society of Young Black Public Health Professionals will be here, and she will introduce our speaker today, Flozell.
Hello, everyone. My name is Diamond Crumby. I am a second-year public health student, getting my master's in community health science. Today, I have the pleasure of presenting our guest speaker, Mr. Flozell Daniels. He is currently the CEO and president of Foundation for Louisiana. It's a public policy and community engagement strategist with expertise in community development, resilience building, legislative strategy, and leadership development. He has led more than $50 million of award-winning community investment strategies while at the foundation. Prior to his appointment at the foundation, Mr. Daniels served as Tulane University's Assistant Vice President and Executive Director of State and Local Affairs for 9 years. Before that, he served as an Urban Policy Specialist and Administrative Assistant in the Office of the Mayor for the City of New Orleans. Mr. Daniels has an MBA from the A.B. Freeman School of Business from Tulane University and a BA in Biological Sciences from the University of New Orleans, and spent 6 years doing materials research for the USDA. He's a New Orleans native who was raised in the Ferret neighborhood. Mr. Daniels has a daughter and spends his free time enjoying second lines, festivals, and other celebrations of Louisiana's amazing culture. Please give a warm welcome to Mr. Daniels.
Thank you. I think I'm going to use this. Good afternoon, everybody. Can you guys hear me? Is this good? Okay, super. Wow, I'm excited to be here. It's good to be back home. As Diamond indicated, thank you for such a gracious introduction. I am born and raised here. Had a chance to be raised by amazing people in a Ferret neighborhood, born at Flint Goodrich Hospital. There's a little history there for those who don't know what that is. Had my first surgery at Charity Hospital, educated in public schools, and had a chance to go to both UNO for undergrad and Tulane for grad school. And what's great about being back in this building, believe it or not, I actually had an office here for a number of years on the top floor. And remember the post-Katrina moment. You guys might know that Canal Street was flooded tremendously after the storm, and all of the electrical equipment wasn't working, so there was no way to get up to the top floor without taking the elevator. So we had to take stairs once we were let back in. And it was a moment for me. It was a chance to not only go back into my office and gather my things. There was much work going on to recover both the business of this university and of this community in recovery. But a strange thing happened. I made it up the stairs. I barely made it up the stairs, and trust me, I was much younger then. I made it back down with my business, with my colleagues, got in my car, and I noticed, as Diamond also indicated, there was a second line a few blocks away, making its way up Rampart and going into the French Quarter. And I immediately park my car. I jump out of the car and I jump in the second line, as I am prone to do. And it was a milestone moment, a watershed moment, really, for me and my family. because it is the moment that I went back home to Houma, Louisiana, where we were living at the time, to tell my family we were coming back with certainty. It was a reminder for me about this community and how much I love it, how much it had invested in me, and how much I wanted to invest in it. And I have been privileged to work with a bunch of folks like you and others to continue to do this work of not just recovering this community, but making it as strong as possible. And so I really am glad to be here with you today to have a discussion about investing in justice, the notion of truth-telling, racial healing, and transformation. So I'm going to do a couple of things. I'll tell you a bit about the Foundation for Louisiana, where I am pleased to work with a team of people, staff and board, that are beyond incredible, and some of the work that we do writ large. I'm going to narrow down on a couple of areas of discussion today: the truth, racial healing, and transformation efforts that we are embarking on, as well as the justice reinvestment work, which we think is a way of thinking about the practice of truth telling and racial healing and transformation. And then I will create some space for us to have, hopefully, as much dialogue and Q&A as possible. Let's see here. So about the Foundation for Louisiana, our mission is to invest in people and practices that work to reduce vulnerability and to make our community stronger and more sustainable across the state. The individuals that founded our work at the Foundation knew early on, there we go, that Katrina was not the only challenge that beset our community. It really was, if you think about the storms of racism and inequity and inopportunity at systems level and beyond, those were the real storms that had hit the shores of Louisiana for generations, long before Katrina. And the Foundation was an opportunity through private dollars, many thousands of people and foundations and corporations to really embark on a journey of justice, a way for us to think about equity and inclusion in the construct of disaster recovery and to build a practice around that. So we've been able to do some pretty interesting stuff, lots of recovery work, rebuilding of houses, helping small business come back to life so we can stoke local economies, and to invest in some of what I think is the best work ever, leadership development, investing in the opportunity for people to show up and lead their communities as folks who have the most wisdom. Some of our value sets here, just a few of those I'll touch on. Community wisdom, this notion that people might have dignity within disaster. If you look at Harvey and Irma, we keep learning these lessons over and over again, and we continue to lean on the power of people and their experience and matching that with data and technology and other forward-looking innovations so that we can really move progress forward in community. And some of my team, some of our partners, there, we like pictures. Areas of impact: racial justice, climate justice, economic opportunity. We consider ourselves a solutions partner, really working on special projects, fiscal sponsorships, and doing what it takes to be in partnership with people in community and organizations to move the work. Our new LGBTQ organizing work is really exciting, and of course, criminal justice reform. Today, I will be focusing on, obviously, racial justice and some of the CJ reform work. And you can see here just some of the details here. I'll talk about TRHC shortly. We were also involved in the monument removal work, and that is probably a presentation unto itself that we could talk about. Leadership development. Our climate justice work is really exciting. Maybe I can come back another time because it really is connected to and germane to your way of thinking about health and community and the intersections of race and opportunity and vulnerability. Of course, criminal justice reform. There are a litany of things that we are privileged to work on. Some of these things are in early stage, and some of them are quite down the road. I'll be talking a bit today in detail about justice reinvestment. And of course, you can't do any of this work. You can't be a social justice organization in Louisiana and not talk about economic opportunity as a critical issue with regard to the lives of people. We believe in community development finance, that is putting our money where our mouth is, with both grants and low-interest loans through our Community Investment Loan Fund, and investing in place-based projects like the Cultural Innovation District and our Together initiative to make sure that we can resource people with both financial resources, technical resources, and partnership, including leveraging our organization as a partner to move on a policy agenda. See our LGBTQ work here, which is statewide and really focused on capacity building and having sustainable resources. And of course, I mentioned earlier being a solution partner. You can see some of the strategies that we have, including our disaster recovery DNA. Having an equitable disaster framework continues to be something, disaster resilience framework continues to be something that's important to us. Having rapid response funds, making sure arts and culture are themes that run across the breadth of our work, and more recently being entrusted with Family Trust for Alton Sterling's children, with a special shout out to actress Issa Rae, who raised that money. Let's move this forward. So, truth, racial healing, and transformation. This is one of the most exciting bits of work that we've been invited to be a part of. The W.K. Kellogg Foundation decided after making more than 10 years of investment in something called America's Healing, where they've been working with communities across the country to give them the resources and the spaces to talk about what does it mean for us to heal with each other as a country, and looking at the tough issue of race and racism. They decided to step back for a moment and work with people in local communities across the country to analyze what were the best practices, what worked and what didn't work, and what would be the next generation of that work. And what came out of it was the truth, racial healing, and transformation work. We actually had a couple of folks like Carol Bebel and Dr. Denise Shervington, who were local people from New Orleans who actually served on the National Advisory Board for that look. What we have is a $3 million award for 3 years so that we can look at the work of changing the narrative about race, building relationships so that we can actually heal with each other within and across races and ethnicities, and investing in strategic practices that actually aim to address racial equity. So the core mission of this work, focus on eliminating the belief in a racial hierarchy. Kellogg actually says jettisoning a belief in racial hierarchy. It's very specific language that allows us to look at behaviors, structures, laws, and public policies that have been and continue to be created deeply rooted in this country's history of believing in racial hierarchy. The intention is to be inclusive of all racial and ethnic communities, and for this work to be implemented across sectors, public and private, academic, faith-based, and really thinking intentionally about the notion of unusual suspects. Who are the folks that normally are not in these conversations that we can bring and invite into discussions in ways that allow us to bring this discussion to scale, and recognizing our interconnectedness and the need for both healing and equity, and really important, creating the infrastructure that sustains healing and advances structural change efforts. Now this is, I love frameworks. I think it's my old research background, and because I love policy, this is essentially what came out of the national discussions with hundreds and hundreds of folks. And these are folk, many of them like you, researchers, some are practitioners, some are out in community, all kinds of people participating in a conversation about how do we develop a framework that gives almost everyone a chance to take it and put it in their back pocket, so to speak, and use it in this work that you care so deeply about. At the top of the framework is narrative change. I understand that this lecture series is essentially about health, race, and communication. We care deeply about all of those things and see the value of narrative change and communication as a mission-critical strategy. We'll talk some about that. It is very intentional that it is the entry point for this truth, racial healing, and transformation framework, and it's very intentional, the sectors that are listed here. For those who may not be able to see it, it's the entertainment industry, journalism and news media, digital media, publishing, school curricula, that's very important, cultural institutions, monuments and parks, i.e. public spaces. And across the breadth of those categories, making sure that we really give some thought to what does it mean for us to create our own strategies that allow us to create a truthful narrative where we get to see ourselves in that narrative and we get to see each other in that narrative as a way of moving forward and entering into this work. And then, as I mentioned earlier, racial healing and relationship building, those go hand in hand. One part healing, and I sometimes use the language within tribe and outside of tribe, this opportunity for us to heal within ourselves, these wounds of racism and history, as well as building relationships with each other. And you see what looks like siloed categories, that's just organizational. These things are meant to overlay each other. Separation, really looking deeply at segregation, colonization, which is still an important discussion in the 21st century in America, as it turns out, and concentrated poverty, along the lines of these sort of subcategories, including some that run across the entire breadth of this framework. Immigration and migration, education and development, you see in both separation, law, and economy. Law, civil, criminal, and public policies. I see some of my friends in the room who are lawyers. They constantly tell me that the legal construct of America is designed and based on this country's racial history. It's baked into the legal system, and that's an important thing that I think the Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation cohort is thinking deeply about. And as you can see, we're looking across the breadth of civil, criminal, and public policies, and I would add practices along these categories so that we can interrogate in the context of truth-telling, in the context of having relationships with each other, how do we then do the transformational work of changing our legal system in a way that creates the outcomes that we care about. And finally, economy. I mentioned this before. You cannot do this work in America without thinking about the importance of the economic framework. I went to the Whitney Plantation this weekend for what I believe is the 4th time. If you haven't gone, I highly recommend it. I am from New Orleans. I do not visit plantations. But this one is amazing. I think it's the only one of its kind in America that is essentially a museum that accurately portrays the lives of enslaved people and does it in a way that is historically accurate, that is respectful, and that actually creates a space for you to learn something and to edify, I think, the kind of values that continue to drive this particular work. One of the things that I took away from the trip that is really important to this citation of how important the economy is how the economy of this country, not just the South, we want to be really clear about if we're going to narrative change, if we're going to be truthful, New Orleans was the most active by volume and economy slave trading place in America for a number of years. So the city became wealthy trading in the lives of people. The South became wealthy trading in the lives of people. And the country, including Wall Street, New York City, Boston, and many other places, became wealthy on the backs and brains of people who had been enslaved as a matter of legal policy and as a matter of separation practice, right? And so these things really do run together, and the same families and communities that retain enormous amounts of wealth are the ones you can still see their names in the archives that show how important history is to this conversation. And so this economy piece continues to be critical. So this is exciting. We've been able to not only get these resources in partnership with Kellogg, we're working with groups of people in both New Orleans and Baton Rouge so that we can also create some learning spaces with each other around these practices. We've hired an incredible team. Rosa's here, Dr. Mark Perry. They're co-leaders in this work, and we're now doing the implementation part of this work, which includes advancing the kind of 2 foundational components, working on this narrative change and beginning to build the resources around that, as well as starting the practice of healing across these communities so that we can actually strengthen people and the institutions that are choosing to do this work across a broad number of sectors. This includes special events, group convenings, and my favorite thing, healing workshops. One of the things that we're already finding in the work is that many people in New Orleans and Baton Rouge are either folks who have been deeply involved in racial equity and healing and activism work for a long time, or they're people who are freshly coming to the work and really trying to figure out what role they play and how they can do that work. And in either case, folks are struggling with their own healing. Folks are already getting exhausted. They're already exhausted in many ways from this work. So we really are trying to think about how do we find spaces to heal people so that they can be strong enough to do the work that then gives us the strength to do the relationship building that allows us to endure within the work, if that makes any sense. So a bit more about narrative change. You guys are thinking a lot about this. What I love about this is it really focuses on two important things: the need to create and distribute new narratives. I took a class at UNO. A woman named Tommy Myrick taught this class, and it was called Blacks in Entertainment. And it was the first time that I understood that there was a very intentional strategy across more than 200 years to create narratives about black people, narratives about Asian people, although everybody was Chinese, right? Because, and other people, the otherness that the Dalai Lama talks about, that would be derisive and that would create very specific images that promoted the kind of racialized behavior that this country was founded on. And so really what we're talking about is addressing those practices that are generational. People have been exposed to these images in entertainment, in journalism, within school curricula. We see these fights happening in Texas and other places in 2017. And of course, within museums, monuments, and parks, as was discussed earlier. And part of what we're trying to do here is really make sure that we can get the truthful narratives that are going to allow people to see themselves in this work and we think be transformational within the lives of people, and also influence people's perspectives and their behavior. One of the things that we talk a lot about is the tension between telling the truth about and using language that is accurate, racial justice, racial equity, really digging down into accurate language versus, or where there is tension with trying to create language that includes people who may not be there yet, but who are persuadable. And there's a real specific strategy and some dealing with the tensions of that. I'll talk about that a little later. That is important if you're going to persuade people to become members of the overall cohort, folks that you want to care about the work that you're doing to heal communities and to develop more racially equal communities. You're going to need to persuade folks to be a part of that. No matter what kind of work you're doing. And so we're giving a lot of thought in the context of narrative change to how do you create narratives that are not just truthful, but that also persuade people and change what our friends at the Opportunity Agenda call public will, that move people to do something different than they were doing before they were exposed to the narrative. And racial healing, focusing on ways for all of us to respectively heal from the wounds of racism and white supremacy. And there's some premises here. We can't assume that everybody believes that there is racism and white supremacy. So, we can talk about that later. And I hope you guys are taking notes or keeping in your mind the questions or even the assertions, challenges you might have for some of what I'm saying here. But focusing on healing those wounds, because it's very real, and Lord knows in the last year we've seen that much more acutely across the country and within even here in our community. And building trusting, intergenerational, and diverse community relationships. I mean, if you think about the challenges that we had in removing Confederate monuments, just as a local example. Guys, these were monuments, and it doesn't matter what your position is on it, for or against. There were death threats. There were people whose careers were being threatened, which is another form of economic terrorism that we see time and time again across generations. And so we know that there's a real need to heal with regard to how people are feeling and how they're experiencing this, but also to build relationships that allow us to do better work and be better communities. So just a few notes on race and health. You guys know this stuff better than we do. 55% of non-elderly uninsured are people of color. Of course, the mortality rates is work that many of you do directly. Blacks are 8 times more likely to die of homicide than whites in Orleans Parish. If you don't believe homicide and murder is the #1 public health issue in New Orleans, we should probably have a conversation later. And in Orleans Parish, blacks are 3 times more likely to die of diabetes and twice as likely to die of kidney disease, and HIV. You all know that work, but it is just a reminder of how connected the racial disparities and this belief in a racial hierarchy has very tangible and specific outcomes, and why we're doing this work. Age-adjusted death rates, of course, you can see across a breadth of diseases where those disparities exist. And I'd like to mention this. This is a little awkward to be in this presentation, but one of the things that we've struggled with for those people who do racial equity work is thinking about how that work gets resourced. Kellogg did a really interesting thing. They put not only resources to carry out the activities of this work, but they also put resources in to make sure that we have permanent resources. Small seed capital to get some endowment going so that we can imagine, much like universities, much like museums and art institutions and other places, that we would have permanent resources so that members of this community could interrogate these questions. One of the important things that we've learned is that folks really think about this as a grant-making program, right? You get your grant, you have 18 months to spend it, you quickly move the money out the door. This is really not that, although there'll be grant-making and support. This is about resourcing a way of being, acculturating, if you will, a set of conversations that take us into the next generation about one of the toughest issues for us to discuss, and that is race in America and how we deal with it. And so we're really excited about this and hope to talk to you some more about it. And so let's talk about going from theory to practice. Baldwin is one of my favorites. Whenever I'm struggling in America, I love this country, but sometimes I hate it. I go back to Baldwin, who always has something wise to say, and I love this. Those who say it can't be done are usually interrupted by others doing it. That's kind of our way of thinking about the work. And so if you think about this framework that we just discussed, one of the ways that we're seeing this put into practice, it's like medicine and law and other forms of practice. We look at policy work as a practice, is the recent justice reinvestment work that's been happening here in Louisiana. So I'm going to deepen this conversation some just to tell you about our experiences with this work, and it continues, as a matter of fact. Last year, Walt Leger, a state representative here in New Orleans, passed a resolution to create what is called the Justice Reinvestment Task Force. The design of it was to finally address severe challenges in Louisiana. We're the most incarcerated place in the world. Governor John Bell Edwards decided to actually impanel this task force. I was lucky enough to be his designee on it, joining a litany of judges and state legislators and many other kinds of folks to do this work. Let me see here. And I just, let's see. So Louisiana is the incarceration capital of the world, stuff you know already. You can see these figures. One of my friends likes to tell me all the time that it is not a criminal justice system. It is a set of systems that work as a master system, all of them working together to disproportionately impact poor people of color and producing terrible outcomes. And by the way, not keeping you safe either. Among black men from New Orleans, 1 in 14 is behind bars, 1 in 7 is either in prison or on parole or probation. Just the kind of terrible numbers we see. So the task force wanted to really look into this information. This information came from the Pew Research Center. We were very fortunate to have them as our research arm and our partners in making sure we had credible information from which to work. And you can see that the drivers of incarceration really include higher than average parole restrictions, hyper-prosecution of nonviolent offenses. We have 1.5 to 3 times rate of incarceration of other southern states. We wanted to be sure that no one charged us with comparing ourselves to New York or Boston or some other Bay Area. And this is due to an increase in the prosecution of nonviolent offenses and sending people to prison, an increase in sentence terms, and probation and parole violations. Just to put a point in that, probation and parole violations and people going back to prison for them is the #1 driver of recidivism and state-level incarceration. And additionally, obviously, we're spending more than $1 billion at the state level to do this. We're not making investments in things like education and health and other things that actually improve people's lives and that make us safer. And so the task force was charged with producing the correctional population and associated spending by focusing prison space on serious and violent criminals. Translation, we wanted to try to be sure that people who don't need to go to prison don't go to prison. It is the worst place in the world for anything that you care about. Holding offenders accountable by looking at research-based supervision and sentencing practices. Again, if we don't have to send people to prison, let's not. Let's do other things that actually heal and transform people and communities and not that hurt them. And reinvest those savings in the strategies shown to decrease recidivism, including improved reentry outcomes. Here are some of the findings. It's amazing. Prison is actually not more effective at reducing recidivism than non-custodial alternatives, right? So recidivism is a strange word. We haven't quite done a great job of defining and isolating what we mean by that. How long after you're released from prison do we still count you as a recidivist if you reoffend? Whether or not it's a felony or a misdemeanor, there are all kinds of things. But generally speaking, when Pew looked at the information and looked across the breadth of best practices, what we found time and time again is that generally speaking, prison is not more effective at reducing recidivism than other forms of non-prison alternatives. And so that's key. And we know that, look at current practices here in Louisiana. Some of this I showed you before, but the use of prison over prison alternatives has been increasing over the last decade in Louisiana. This is, while, by the way, we have good information long ago that prison is not great for what we're trying to get done here. And the use of prison alternatives has not only been limited by low resources, it has been statutorily restricted. So you remember that framework that talked about law and the legal constructs that actually create racial inequity? That's part of what we're talking about. Geographical variabilities, you especially see this in rural communities across Louisiana where there are fewer options. And of course, as I mentioned, funding, which is also very, very intentional. Look at this chart. This is the one that when the task force met, we could not believe it, because we generally think about southern states as all the same, right? When you think about Florida, Georgia, Texas, right? South Carolina, you think, oh yeah, we're all terrible in this. We're significantly worse than the second worst offender in this. And the gray, just to be clear, those are nonviolent offenses. The kind of stuff that that you're not scared of, mostly, right? And we're sending people to state prison for long periods of time, you all. So this was a watershed moment in the work of the task force, and people really thinking about, oh, this is what we're talking about. This is the evidence, not only for us, but quite frankly, people who have not been the usual suspects in looking at this work. The private sector, the business community, the religious right, people who traditionally have not been on what I would call the right side of this discussion, were persuaded by this and other points that we found, and it really helped to sort of amplify and accelerate the work. Here you go again with newly sentenced prison admissions. One of the other drivers is a litany of laws that increase not only the number of people going to prison, but the sentences for which people go to prison. You can see here drugs. You can also include property and other. It's a significant number of people being taken out of society, taken away from their families. You all know the largest growing population of people going to prison are women. Many of them have children. And so we see this work here. Longer prison stays do not reduce recidivism either. So not only does prison not actually work any better than non-prison alternatives, what we have is a situation where sentences have gone up significantly, and the evidence tells us that going to prison for longer periods of time, 2 years versus 10 years, doesn't matter. But that's exactly what we've been doing, and why the Justice Reinvestment Task Force was looking at this work. And you can just see here a comparison from 2010 to 2015, how many more people were made ineligible by way of parole eligibility, which is a big issue, as you can see here. Now, this is a chart that shows over a number of years how the legislature voted on parole ineligibility. So I want to be really clear about this. The light green represents nonviolent parole restrictions, and the dark green are for violent. So even if you only care about nonviolent, which is the way some people think. We tend to like to look at the whole picture. We had in the last 15 years more than 85 new laws restricting parole eligibility for people who didn't need to be in prison, who were taken away from their families, who were taken away from the local economies in which they could have been working and doing and being and contributing to society. And so what we've accomplished, it's really interesting. We looked at all of this work, and we knew that it was really important for the task force to fight for as strong a set of recommendations as possible so that we can actually do the work of fighting for those recommendations in the legislative context. We had more than 20 really strong recommendations. We were very fortunate. They were opposed by the District Attorneys Association and others who were using fear tactics to say if you release these scary people, we're going to be harmed in community. So we were able to beat that back. And interestingly, we have folks who say you're never going to get these bills passed. And we had a number of bills that were reforming sentencing, a number of bills that reformed parole eligibility, a number of bills that looked at justice reinvestment. We were able to get 70% of the savings, what is nearly $200 million estimate, so that we can make grants to nonprofits and public sector organizations and others for the purpose of data-driven, research-driven reentry efforts. I'll make a note to say that the fight is still on to make sure that those things are designed well and according to best practice and in a way that really helps us. And we were able to pass those bills. It was historic. The one we lost on was the felony class bill. We really wanted to create a felony class construct that would simplify sentencing as a way of reducing both the length of sentences and the number of people that go to prison. We just lost that one. And there is now a felony class task force. For those of you interested, that's meeting tomorrow in Baton Rouge. There's an opportunity here. And they will do that work, and we hope to come back in the next legislative session with a strong set of recommendations about how we can actually send people back home, how we can make sure people don't go to prison, making our communities healthier and stronger and less racially disparate. A special shout out here to our friends with the Greater New Orleans Funders Network that the Foundation for Louisiana is a part of. There was a communication strategy. There was a narrative strategy that was specifically deployed to make sure that we can fight the good fight and make sure that we were ready for the opposing forces. We were fortunate enough to be able to develop resources that allowed us to develop a media strategy, that allowed us to work with grassroots activists and faith communities and people across the entire state, from Shreveport to New Orleans, from Lake Charles to Baton Rouge, so that we can make sure that we were not only on the same page, that we also were able to make sure people had the resources to show up to Baton Rouge and elevate their voices, let their legislators and others know that they had a stake in this. And it was not only folks, it was certainly folks who had been in prison and whose family members were in prison, but it was also businessmen and faith leaders. It was folks who typically don't show up to these discussions, policy advocates across different areas of work like housing and LGBTQ rights and economic opportunity. People seeing the lives of the people that they care about and are trying to work on their issues are being impacted by this issue and seeing the chance to come and show up so that they can have a bit of an intersectoral approach to the work. And so we now, we're thinking about, just a note here about why it worked. We had a strange confluence of things. A Democratic governor in a very red state who decided to take this issue on. We had a number of conservative legislators who quietly had been working on the issue and had been persuaded over years by their faith leaders and other business leaders who were looking, so-called right and smart on crime people who really were pushing on this. We had the stalwarts like the Black Caucus and others, and most importantly, we had a group of activists and advocates and people from community, including the university world, who showed up for this work and who were willing and able and were ready for the opportunity. And so we really tried to make the most of it. We also used, as I mentioned earlier, truthful, high-impact narratives that took advantage of sort of multilateral approach. We had town halls all across the state of Louisiana that were not just places where people like me presented information and data, but it is where people came to the microphone and told their own stories in their own voice with their own words. And they looked like everybody in this room, black, white, young, old, urban, rural, professional, and not, telling their stories about how this system has sucked them and their loved ones into it in ways that were hurting their communities. One-on-one discussions, intersectoral discussions, as I mentioned before, across public and private, nonprofits, faith and business, and a very savvy media approach, working to make sure we got letters to the editor, meetings with editorial boards, making sure that folks were blogging about the issue, making sure that people were getting the word out so that we can have the kind of at-scale approach. Almost every major newspaper in Louisiana wrote an editorial in favor of these changes, unheard of, across the state, not just New Orleans, not just some parts of Baton Rouge, but the entire state. And of course, as I mentioned before, our friends at the Funders Network and the Action Table making timely and specific investments, showing how philanthropy can actually show up as a partner in community to get this work done. So, as always, I'd like to end these discussions with a call to action. I'm not sure exactly what you all are working on, your students, your professors, you have different seats in which you sit. We are actively and always looking for people to be members of the team. The Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation work doesn't work unless you show up for it and really decide to be a part of, whether it's the New Orleans or the Baton Rouge cohort, to really show up for the work that you care about, and also to add the talents that you bring to that conversation so that we can really do the work of narrative change, racial healing, and relationship building, and transforming across and within those categories that I mentioned earlier. We're also extremely interested in you thinking about what role, if any, you might play in the areas that you care about within the justice reinvestment, the implementation part of that work. In addition to the Felony Class Task Force, which is an active opportunity for people to hold those players accountable to some really forward-looking strategies, we're going to be engaged in a lot of reentry work, a lot of looking at different parts of the system, the judiciary, prosecutorial practices, policing, and other things. You get a chance to be a part of those conversations, not only by way of the work that you do day to day, but also by bringing your civic leadership to the fore and really helping us move on that agenda. And so that's it. I would love, I know at some point some of the students have to leave, and so I'm hoping we can, if any of you have questions before you have to leave, it would be great to engage in that.
Yes, so Diamond and I will walk up and down the aisles with microphones so that we can capture this. We are recording this. It will be on the YouTube channels of the Tulane PRC and Tulane MCH. The links are on the Facebook event page. Does anyone have a question for Mr. Daniels at this point? All right, we got one in the back.
I was wondering if you could please spend a moment addressing the issue of mental health and prison and young men who have been incarcerated all their life who are really bipolar and schizophrenic and out on the street alone. If there's any halfway houses or stuff like that where they could live, not as restricted as the men's shelters and places they've been in, and they're just choosing to be, it's just tragic.
It's an excellent question. The question is about the subject of mental health in relation to incarceration. I think there are a few points. One is we know that a disproportionate amount of people who go to prison are actually folks who need treatment for other reasons. So we see this both in New Orleans at our local jail, which acts more like a prison. It is one of the most dangerous prisons in America by way of the number of people who have died, been raped, been maimed, and been hurt physically, and all of the psycho-emotional challenges that presents to people who have that experience, including children. So many folks have been fighting that battle in New Orleans, getting some wins, really moving the city council and others to stop sending young people to the jail, also working on efforts. This is notable. When we started this work in 2011, Mayor Landrieu put a task force together to look at it. and it did a lot more work than I think was originally intended or imagined. On that day, there were 3,500 people in the local jail. We were the most incarcerated city in America. As we stand here today, the daily census is about 1,500 people, the largest reduction in a local jail in America over that time period. Looking at pretrial services, looking at reducing unnecessary police arrests and things of that nature, I will tell you, ma'am, part of what we haven't done a great job of is, and I mentioned this earlier, building the infrastructure, the institutional infrastructure to be sure that we have alternatives. I don't even like the word alternative. We should just be thinking about what do folks need to be healthy and well, and we should be providing those resources for our neighbors and our fellow residents. We haven't done a great job of that. It has not helped that former Governor Bobby Jindal decimated the mental health system at the state level. You have got to pay attention to state budgets and systems and institutional behavior, because many of the folks who had the talent, community mental health and community well-being professionals, many of them, as I understand it, had to leave the state because there was no way for them to make a living. They no longer had the support for that. We're now in the process of really trying to imagine and build support for what it means to build those institutions. And the last thing I'll add to that answer is that not only is it that people are going to prison instead of getting the kind of health supports that they need, psycho-emotional and others, but very well people are being put in jail and prison and being made emotionally unstable. So this is an important point. We are investing not only in what doesn't work, but we are investing in what is hurting people. And that is a critical element of the mental health landscape, both here in New Orleans and across the state. You cannot be the most incarcerated place in the world and not be investing in and subjecting your people to being emotionally unwell. They go together, and we see it time and time again. We're hoping in the reinvestment strategy that was mentioned, there's some space made for us to really look at best practice, but we're not going to be able to do that without the community support for pushing a larger conversation on mental health infrastructure in Louisiana, working with the Department of Health and Hospitals and others to really elevate the resources that we do have. Medicaid expansion is a great space for that, but we got to build the infrastructure and do the work of building the pipeline of professionals that can actually help implement that work. So I appreciate the question.
I have a follow-up question, actually, Mr. Daniels.
Yes,
you talked about how you were able to counter the district attorneys who tried fear tactics, and I read the back and forth between you and them, or really them and you. Can you talk more about how you were able to overcome those fear tactics and their opposition to the work that you were trying to do?
Sure. The answer may sound oversimplified.
That's okay.
But one of the tactics that the DAs have used and other people in the system, it was interesting to be at the Whitney and to see the exhibit, and they talked about the slave patrols. They talked about the development of police departments, if you will, originally as slave patrols. They talked about the men that invested in the creation of Angola prison, and you know, debt peonage and convict leasing and the economies that make this system work. And one of the things that DAs have done for generations is scare people. I've had people say to me, well, if you say something, if you fight the DAs, they might convict you, because they have the power to literally charge you with things that don't exist and really do harm to your life, to people you care about, to others in your community, your church members. And so people have been really scared. So one of the moments of courage that I saw happen with hundreds of people across the state was they decided we were going to, for once, tell the truth, that DAs are possibly the most significant driver of incarceration in this country. They have extraordinary powers beyond the judiciary, beyond police, beyond the mayor, to send people to prison, often for things that are not true, or to overcharge, sending people to prison. They may have done something really small, they make it look really big. And so we're working on that work. But it was truth-telling. It was sending letters to the editor. It was having interviews with the media. It was having faith leaders go and speak to legislators. It was confronting DAs in the meetings these are public meetings, as is the Felony Class Task Force meeting, and really calling them out when they were telling lies about why it was going to be so scary and why your kids were going to be unsafe when you released this guy who may have stolen a pair of tennis shoes and is sitting in a 12-year sentence, for instance. And we really pushed back, and folks really started to get it. Legislators started to get it. The media were educated and really got the data themselves and started to write more accurate stories. And hopefully over time we can help them see the role that they've played in setting forth these caricatures of people that are not truthful and ineffective. But it was the truth-telling and the media strategy and pushing back on them. And the truth is they've never been pushed back on. And I don't think they were ready for the conversation. It is also important to say they continue to fight the bad fight. They're looking to undermine the work of this Felony Class Task Force. They're looking to undermine the implementation of this work. We're not going to succeed if we don't have folks showing up to continue to advocate for this work. It's great to get policies passed, but none of it matters if it's not enforceable, and it only gets enforced by people in community who care about that work. And it also helped, quite frankly, that we have one of the most unethical prosecutorial landscapes in the country. We have the highest or second highest number of revocations of capital charges, capital convictions, and other high-level convictions. We have people who've been sent to death row and to prison for things that they never did. And most of that has been, we have the highest number of Brady violations cited by the Supreme Court. I mean, I could go on, and it's hard to say that you're going to be as they say, a minister of justice when you're found to not be telling the truth and to be sending people to prison unethically over and over and over again. Yeah.
So you mentioned prison alternatives as a way to work on recidivism as opposed to prison sentences. And I was wondering if you could go into that a little bit more, talk some about the alternatives, what we know about their impact, and also what might incentivize the DAs and the judges to go with that as opposed to prison sentences.
That's a good question, and it's a complex answer. First, I would say, and what we've learned is we should just stop arresting people who don't need to be arrested. And this is important for all of us. And you've been in a situation before, you see a strange person in your neighborhood, right? Something happens, you have a car accident, you're suspicious about something, a child is misbehaving at school, we call the police. We call the police for everything. And it's not what it was ever designed to do. Well, it was not designed to do anything good in the first place, but that's another conversation. But in the 21st century, we really should be reserving the times when we call the police, but for violent or very serious situations. So that's something we can do. Second, I think there are a litany of options with regard to pre-arrest diversion, so police officers can be trained and incentivized to not take people to jail, but to take them to the hospital, to take them to a clinic, to take them to a sobriety center where they can just sit down and drink some water and sleep it off. You'd be surprised how many people we send to jail locally for that kind of thing. And also, even for some other kinds of crimes, trespassing and others, we really need to start diverting people away from jail. My understanding, and this is not my expertise, but from people I trust, psycho-emotional challenges and addictions to substances are a huge reason why people behave in ways that are what lawyers call status offenses, right? This sort of things that you do that get you arrested, or juveniles who are out past the curfew. People go to jail still for these things or get cited for these things. We should not be bringing people to jail for those things. And for more serious offenses at the state level, I think there are many judges and others who are already thinking about ways to send people to treatment or to create restitution. Wouldn't it be interesting if, Mr. Joe, who stole his neighbor's lawnmower, was given an opportunity to pay her back and to do some kind of restitution versus spending 9 or 18 months in state prison, which you, by the way, are paying for. It makes absolutely no sense over a $300 offense. Those are the kind of things that we suspect are going to be elevated as we move down the road of best practice, looking at the reinvestment dollars and how we can best guide those dollars to support things that, that help not only reentry, but we hope to get at the front of the issue with diversion. I appreciate the question. Mm-hmm. Yes, ma'am.
Mike.
Hi. Do you think that if the public knew how much it costs to put someone in prison a day, that they would understand that you're paying maybe 15 to 18, maybe $20,000 a year over a $300 offense?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the question is about the cost and whether that's a point of persuasion for the public. I mean, I think there's good news and bad news. We certainly use the cost of incarceration as a major point in the JRI work, and we continue to interrogate that with local work, and it's persuasive to people who care about that. So libertarians care about that. People who care about investing in social services, infrastructure, children and families, and see we don't have the money because we're spending it on this. It's a persuasive argument. Many people, most people, I think the research tells us, are first driven by fear. This is why every survey you see, every candidate who's running for mayor and city council, what is at the top of their list of things to do? Crime, police, public safety, right? Even though typically what they're talking about are things that don't make the public safe, and they don't include significant parts of the public. Most people who go to prison are people who themselves are victims of crime and of victimization. But they're not typically included in the public. It is another way that race and racism and racialized hierarchy or belief in it shows up not just in our systems level behavior, but in our individual practices. Some folks have been saying this, and I think it really is a great question. We're hoping to use the cost as a way to interrogate that with folks who care about that, but we also have to create some really innovative communication strategies that move the hearts of people to stop being scared of black folk and stop being scared of brown folk and stop being scared of young men and anything else that shows up in the way we think about fear and how that fear dictates our behavior. So a city like New Orleans, which ought to be the most progressive place in Louisiana, it should be one of the most progressive places in America, right? Laissez-faire, right? The city that CARE forgot ends up having one of the most conservative and harmful criminal justice systems in the world, and it is largely controlled by people whose families have a history of racial and class oppression. And so we have to create strategies that not only allow us, ma'am, to use the financial cost, but to also call out the moral cost and the societal cost that really should, we hope, move people to think and act differently.
We have a question back here.
Hello. I think your work is beautiful, and this presentation really encouraged me in a lot of different ways. My question is, as I look at what you're doing, it really is that next level strategy of Martin Luther King's work, really what he was talking about right before he died. What are how should we look at this in terms of milestones, in terms of expectations, tangible ones that we can see? You know, seeing is believing. And so what should we look for? How do we manage our expectations? This is enormous work. I loved how you talked about legacy investments and how long-term endowment investments, so that this conversation, this dialogue, these questions can cross over for generations. Help us frame our expectations so that we can remain excited and be in alignment with where you are.
I love the question. Her question is about expectations and how we can have. I would actually say shoot for the moon. I recently have been in meetings. I've been fortunate enough to do this kind of work for 20 years. And quite frankly, we sometimes, we start to think about, well, what can we get done? Well, we don't know if we can get that done. Maybe if we can't get that done, let's step back and maybe, well, we can't get that done either. Well, maybe we can go, and next thing you know, you've negotiated yourself into getting nothing done. And if you think about this notion of legacy, anything that's ever been done in this country or in this world that's great, anything that has changed the lives of people and their children's lives, have been brave and courageous unreasonable things, right? The civil rights movement was considered unreasonable, dangerous. You all shouldn't be putting your lives on the line like that, folks were told. But they did. You see it in the women's suffrage movement. You see it in the recent immigration rights work. You see it in everything. People are being told, you're just unreasonable. I think we ought to be unreasonable. I think our expectations ought to be that people are free. And until they are free, we have work to do. And in the context of the criminal justice system, we should be pushing, candidly, I'm an abolitionist. I believe, ultimately, it is society's job to invest in its people in a way that we don't need jails, that prisons are not a good investment. They don't actually keep us safe. They undermine the lives of people and the future of a community. And I think that should be our expectation. And we should put numbers to it. We should put milestones to it. When the local jail task force looked at the local jail in 2011, one of the things we were able to conclude, we had research and we had data. We had a fancy guy named Dr. James Austin to come in and interrogate and look at this stuff for us. And we decided that the jail that had, by the way, 6,800 people in it the day Katrina hit. Can you imagine? For a city our size. That based on our level of crime and our population and some other things, that the jail should be about 1,438 people, give or take. Let's say 1,400 people. And so it gave us a number. It gave us a way to rally. It gave us a way to tell city council members, the mayor and other leaders, this is our expectation. These are the steps that we're going to take. We even put numbers to every step. We think if we do this, we can have 82 fewer people. If we do this, they'll have 128 fewer people. A bunch of dozens and dozens of folks, people in philanthropy, nonprofits, grassroots activists, public sector leaders, others worked on this work, putting just what I think you're saying, milestones, specific numbers, specific expectations to how we'll behave. I mean, I think that's the future of this work. We should be saying, this is what we want. We want no recidivism. You can slice it and dice it how you want. If people are in prison, they should never have to go back to prison. What does it take for us to make investments that do that? We should not be sending any children to jail, ever. What does that look like for us? And what kind of systems will we create to make sure that we don't do that? And as crazy as it sounds, I think it's the only thing that opens the door to a set of what might be called more reasonable discussions to get us to make the progress that we need. I'm sorry for such a crazy answer, but yes, ma'am. Here and here.
Thank you. Regarding a lot of these policies, they generally are using a lot of statistics for specifically the male population.
Sure.
But like you said, with the female population, it's on the rise at really an alarming rate, and a lot of the women have families that are affected, and it just contributes to the generational issue. So what, within the justice reinvestment, the reinvestment aspect and the work that you're doing for implementation, what are some of the things that are, at least will touch upon the female population, the maternal population, and the, or potentially even target them?
It's a good question. I don't know if we have specific things yet.
Okay.
I know that there are specific strategies for the women's prison and a bunch of folks that are working on some stuff locally. In the task force and in the legislation, we did not cite specific gender-based strategies. I really appreciate you elevating the issue. It came up in the discussion the other day. I think you're going to see a lot more interest in that area. We'd love to have you and others of you who are working on those issues to come and help us think about that. I think when you look at the Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation framework, you see health and housing in that separation category. One of the things that we're seeing with regard to incarceration is a situation we saw in the 90s when I was in the mayor's office. You saw laws created so that women could not have the men that they were in relationship with live with them, right? So you talk about the sort of legacy level separating of families from each other. And similarly, we see women going to prison for nothing more than being in relationship with men that we think are dangerous. In relationships where they may be participating in some behavior that is much more about their relationship and not about their intentions to be criminals, if that makes any sense. And so they're being swept up into this system as well, and you can see then why it's important for us to really think about building power with each other across gender and across race and across class and community so that we can help each other with those things. The issue with women and girls is increasingly an issue that we need to interrogate. I hope to have some better answers for that soon, but we need to look at that, and I think...
A lot about building relationships. I was wondering if you believe that we can really build relationships with police given the fact that they were created to patrol enslaved Africans, or if ideally you envision dismantling police altogether.
You know, it's a good question. So I think in the near term, we've seen some examples of opportunities. It is a tough thing to do, so let me just be candid. The design of policing, and I have spoken with friends and family of mine who are police officers, people who have retired, they will tell you that the system itself is set up to behave the way it behaves. They have a different set of laws by which they operate. They can shoot people in the back and not be punished for it. I mean, it's just an incredible situation that we have to deal with. But we have seen some glimmers of hope. Locally, the Independent Police Monitor, which does a great job and finally has the kind of independence it needs to do an even better job going forward to help us with these issues, created an innovative strategy that allows police to be in relationship with community by way of mediation, right? And so when you think about what does it mean to build relationships, one of those things could be us thinking about structured, well-designed strategies that allow very tense relationships to be eased through systems-level interventions like this mediation program that they've created. We might look to things like that. We actually are about to embark, as you saw earlier, on a police accountability strategy. The amazing Amika Reale is in the back there. It's going to help us have a conversation with people in New Orleans and Baton Rouge. We're in different places with regard to our relationship with police. But what does it look like for us to think about accountability? What does it look like for us to build relationships that are community-centered and people-centered and not police-centered? If they are, in fact, to protect and serve, what does it look like for us to build those relationships? I do believe it can happen. More importantly, I think it has to happen because we're not going to be abolishing the police department anytime soon, I suspect. And so...
I noticed, like in the beginning of the presentation with the foundation, one area that wasn't was a core thing. You had housing, but transportation.
Yeah.
And my question, sir, is there still room for transportation to be one of those key topics? I mean, we know we can just go on and on about transportation or land use.
Yeah.
As it relates to racism around New Orleans or southern Louisiana?
Well, it's an important question. So transportation, land use, I would add sort of zoning and planning. Those are things that we've had a chance to be in deep partnership with community around to look at. And there are also places where the belief in a racial hierarchy show up in a really specific way. We see it happening locally with regard to both New Orleans and in the region, the coastal region in particular, where people are being shunted into communities that are more likely to flood, that have no transportation. They are the only places where so-called affordable but typically unsafe housing is available. So there's a real connection to housing there as well. And I think it's a part of the public policy work. We've been able to resource some members of community who have created a Riders Advisory Committee with the local transit authority to begin to have some permanent way to interrogate those issues. I think it continues to be something that we look at. I also know the city is working very hard in the context of workforce development, the Network for Economic Opportunity, and matching transit policy to make sure that people at least can get to work and to school and to other kinds of cultural institutions that matter in their lives. So I appreciate you elevating the issue as a part of this larger framework.
I have a question. So you mentioned there's going to be a gathering tomorrow? A gathering in Baton Rouge?
Yeah, so the Felony Class Task Force, thank you for that. I'm always pitching. The Felony Class Task Force, one of the major things we did not get done in the last legislative session is going to be looking at developing a strategy for Louisiana to do what almost the entire country has done, and that is to create simplified classes of felonies that allow us to put into categories the offenses that people commit or they are alleged to have committed, let's say that specifically, so that we can actually have a much more expeditious judiciary process and expedite people through it, but more to the point, to make sure that we understand that we have more consistency across practice across the state, so that a lot more folks, we think, won't go to prison, because the truth is they may have committed some really nonviolent, low-level crime. We're going to take some of the discretion out of the system. The meeting is tomorrow, I believe, at 10 o'clock in Baton Rouge. We can get the details, and it is open to the meeting, open to the public, as all these meetings are. And we would love for you guys to really look at that entire schedule of meetings, and if you want to participate and see how the sausage is made, and see how the dynamics are structured from a systems level, and some of the communication strategies, some of the fear-mongering that I suspect will be going on, and ways that we can actually create a counter-narrative to move that work forward. Thank you for that.
Up here.
Hi. Okay, so my question kind of goes into what you're talking about right now. I'm from Baton Rouge, and like in the past year, you know, I've been involved in some of the community organizing that's going on with everything with Alton Sterling, and the meetings that they've had as far as legislation.
Right.
How do you go about addressing, because they exert power, and it's typically a hidden type of power where people come in and they feel like they have a voice, and then you can't say this, you can't say that if you raise your voice, and they take you off, and they've even jailed some of the activists.
Right.
So what practices have you all used to kind of bring in, create these spaces that are free spaces that, you know, the politicians don't have the power to say, you can't say that, but also, you know, incorporates everybody? Because I know that's an issue that we have there.
It's a great question. My answer is an evolving answer, because I think we're learning some things, and so it is iterative, to be honest with you. But in the context of building power to be able to have impact, I frequently tell people it's one thing to be right, it's another thing to be effective, and you have to do both. One of the things that we learned in the justice reinvestment work, and this is by no means a pristine model or what have you, but you have got to build relationships across communities and sectors so that you can have the influence that you need. Baton Rouge is, in particular, if I understand it, your city council is majority conservative. I think there's a sense that no matter what you do, no matter how much noise you make, the votes are still going to go 7-5 or whatever that mix looks like. So what does it mean, for instance, in Baton Rouge for grassroots activists, to be in relationship with policy advocates, to be in relationship with law schools and professors and others who care about and work on these issues, to be in relationship with faith communities who might be drawn into the conversation, so that you can actually build some consensus around the strategies, build power, so that you can amplify the voices that are still grounded in grassroots activism and the real experience of people in community, but really builds a team to make yourself stronger. It's uneasy work. It's not comfortable work, typically. We've done a lot of it. It continues to be uncomfortable, to be honest with you. I will tell you, I have not seen in Louisiana an instance where significant policy changes happened and we at least get to fight for good implementation without building those teams and partnerships across some political and class and community lines. And I suspect over the next 5 or 10 years, that's going to be the work in Baton Rouge, trying to do that. I appreciate the work you're doing. That's good stuff. All right. If you guys don't have other questions, I'm going to start questioning you. Yes, ma'am.
Another opportunity for more pitching. But if we wanted to do something with the New Orleans cohort, what are some of the meetings or activities that we can get involved in?
So that work, fortunately, with the Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation work in New Orleans is just getting started. And one of the things, as you saw earlier, that they're doing is working with the original, there were about 15 folks who were the original team that are doing this work. Unlike a normal program, we don't get to tell people what to do. Like, there is sort of an iterative approach. We really are in partnership with community, and we are hoping that folks like you and others decide to show up. And so we can take your information. There's going to be a number of opportunities, communication opportunities to invite people into meetings. The first thing that we're doing, though, is looking at the landscape to make sure that we're capturing all the work in New Orleans that is already happening. Some of you at your church, at your university, within your neighborhood organizations, you may have been participants in the welcome table. You may have been folks involved in pushing for the Confederate monument removal. No matter how you've shown up in the racial equity discussion, and in many different kinds of ways, we're hoping to really collect all those folks, all those organizations, and really think about how we maximize the work, think about how we document the lessons learned already, and start to build relationships from there. And so one answer is to be on the lookout for what should be a pretty broad communication to invite people into the process. And two, if you yourself are involved in something like that, we'd love to hear about it. You can send a note to the foundation or be in touch with one of our staff members, and we'll pick it up from there.
And if you signed in when you came in, the sign-in sheet is out there. We will make sure to pass along any links or information that Mr. Daniels wants to give to you guys.
Great.
Please do sign in.
Going once, going twice.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Daniels. And please, everyone, join me in thanking him. That concludes today's seminar. We have 2 more seminars in our series. The next one is next Thursday. Same time, different floor. We'll be on the 12th floor, and we will have the principals from the Bach group talking about LGBT issues in the Black community. And the day after that, we will have 2 ladies from the Office of Public Health, Bureau of Family Health, talking about, is your data unintentionally causing or reinforcing racial disparities? So if you're a data person, that one will be good too. Flyers are out in the back. Thank you again, everyone, for being here.